Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm delighted to be joined by our guest, Paddy Linighan, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Clyde Co. Paddy brings 30 years of experience in the legal sector, and he was formerly the Chief Operating Officer at Clyde Co. But now he has responsibility for sustainability across the organisation. So he leads the firm's efforts to reduce its environmental impact, enhances its social responsibility, and promotes its diversity and inclusion. In addition to that, Paddy is also a director at the Legal Sustainability Alliance. So the LSA has been established for a number of years now, and this is an association that is committed to supporting the legal sector to measure and manage their carbon emissions to achieve net zero. So basically putting sustainability at the heart of the legal sector. So yes, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Paddy today. So welcome, Paddy.
Thanks, Mel. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Now, before we begin, could you tell me something that not many people know about you?
Perhaps apt, given the new series of Strictly Come Dancing started last week. In my formative years, I was a Latin and ballroom dancer, and if I'm being modest, not a bad one at that. However, it was quite personally challenging though. I grew up in a working class steel town, so it was albeit not quite the Billy Elliot level, and glitter balls were definitely swapped for church halls, but not a lot of people know that.
Well, that's really interesting. And Strictly's just started up again. So I'm not going to quite look at Strictly in the same way. I'm going to be imagining you now, Paddy, on that dance floor. Right. Yeah, that was quite surprising, actually. Yeah, wow, excellent. So, yeah, before we dive into the questions about sustainability and the work that you've been doing at Clyde & Co, could you just give a bit of an overview on Clyde & Co as an organisation?
Yeah, of course, Mel. Clyde's are a global law firm. We set out to help organisations successfully navigate risk and maximise the opportunity in the sectors that underpin global trade, namely insurance, aviation, marine, construction, energy trade and natural resources. We believe we're unique in that we operate as one globally integrated organisation, which allows us to offer a comprehensive range of contentious and non-contentious legal services and commercially minded legal advice to businesses operating across the world in a seamless fashion. As you've already picked up on, we are committed to operating in a responsible way by progressing a diverse and inclusive workforce that reflects the communities and the clients it serves and provides an environment in which hopefully everyone can realise their potential. So we use our legal and professional skills to support communities through pro bono work, volunteering, charitable partnerships, and linked to today, minimising the impact we have on the environment through a commitment to SBTi net zero standards and the setting of ambitious emissions reduction targets. Dimensionally, we have just under 500 partners, just over 2,700 lawyers, 3,216 legal professionals across the world, and operating out of 70 offices, both full offices and associated offices worldwide.
Great, thanks very much for that overview, Paddy. Now, before the recording, I was taking a look at the Clyde & Co website, and I was really impressed with the Responsible Business Report. I think for our ISO Show listeners, if you are looking for an example of an exemplary sustainability report, then I'd definitely check out Clyde & Co's website. So, Paddy, I was reading within that report that Clyde & Co have set ambitious net zero targets. Could you just explain a bit more about these targets and your approach to achieving them?
Yeah, well, thank you for reading the report. It's not the smallest of documents to read. We believe our net zero targets are highly ambitious. We have a high level of transparency, which we think, coupled with thought leadership and advocacy for corporate climate action, will enable us to support both our clients and our peers to making an accelerated just transition towards a low carbon economy sort of leading from the front. I often use the phrase of the Tour de France peloton, but we need to keep the peloton together. Our near-term and long-term targets have both been validated by the SBTi, and we've gone for a near-term target which seeks to reduce our Scope 1 or Scope 2 emissions absolutely by 80% by 2030, and our Scope 3 emissions by 50% in the same time frame. But ultimately, we're targeting net zero, which under SBTi terminology is a 90% reduction in our emissions by 2038. And our approach, or at least the background to our approach, is relatively simple. We are focused on decarbonising our operations across the globe in absolute terms. I think that's as good as it can get, and that's what we need to do.
Great. I think that the way that you've set it out in that report is really clear as well. I think, just to highlight the key word that you mentioned there about transparency, and which is one of the core principles of ISO 14064, which we'll come on to talk about later on. So within that report, there are also a number of different sustainability initiatives that Clyde Co have been involved with over the last year or so. Could you just provide some insights into some of those initiatives as well?
Yeah, our sustainability initiatives can be broadly grouped into three categories. One I've touched on already, which is reducing our carbon footprint, which is purely decarbonising our operations. But we also need to look at how we address our wider environmental impact, such as water consumption, paper consumption, etc. And then ultimately at the end of the decarbonisation journey is to offset our residual emissions through offsetting removal projects. Not untypical of corporate occupiers and professional services organisations, though, 95% of our carbon emissions footprint resides in our Scope 3. It sits in our supply chain. So in reality, there are only three things we can do to decarbonise our operations. One is to look to maintain a low carbon and resilient supply chain. So we're working to reduce the impact of our purchase of goods and services by rationalising our supply chain globally. But we're looking to do that by supporting our suppliers they themselves to measure, then reduce their emissions, and then we look to incorporate our sustainability requirements into our procurement and due diligence processes. Perhaps for a professional services firm, a little bit more of a challenge is using sustainable business travel. In the summer of 2023, our management board adopted the approval of a global note on sustainable travel. And this is really looking towards acting in the best interests of Clyde Co. And we'll be ultimately then incorporating those overarching principles in regional travel policies, and we're working with our travel management companies to both implement those, improve the data quality of collection, and prioritise sustainability over cost. And then perhaps where I came into the operating energy efficient and low carbon workplaces, so the Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions. And we are looking to transition away from direct consumption or indirect consumption of fossil fuels to renewable energy in the heating and cooling of our buildings. And as at the summer of 2023, the UK offices were 100% renewable, and we are seeking to replicate this across our global portfolio. And we appreciate that may not be possible in all the jurisdictions in which we operate. So it may well be we need to compensate in some jurisdictions for others by going to 100% renewable rather than partial renewable. But those are broadly the three areas we've got to focus on in terms of decarbonising our operations.
Fantastic. So it sounds as though that was an impressive range of different sustainability initiatives, but of course, you need people within the organisation to be able to understand why we're doing this. You'd obviously think that most people are aware that there is a climate emergency at the moment, so it wouldn't really take any persuasion, but there's still quite a lot of education involved in relation to some of these changes, I think, that we're seeing, which can then affect the culture of an organisation as well. And, going back to what I was saying about, the LSA, about making, sustainability at the heart of a law firm practice. I noticed in the report that you'd introduced a climate awareness training on Earth Day last year. Could you just explain how you did this and what the potential impact has been as a result of doing that?
Yes, this was in effect our first test at trying to raise awareness and an understanding of how aware our colleagues were in relation to climate change. So it wasn't mandatory. It was just a series of blogs and videos which had been produced for us by AXA Climate School in Paris, which went through from April 22nd, which was Earth Day, through to World Environment Day, which was 5th of June. And each week we'd issue a video on a particular subject associated with climate change, be it maladaptation, adaptation, task force for nature-related financial disclosures, eco-anxiety, and then a series of blogs which were issued by actually our trainee population, which around plastic pollution, save water, beekeeping, composting. It was all just sort of what could you do as an individual to make a difference? And it was really just to start to drive that behavioural change to reduce negative impacts and make a difference. And what that led to was the launch of a global colleague Zeros One campaign in November 2023, which was about then empowering all of our organisation to understand their impact. If they wanted to make changes as individuals, if they wanted to take the cudgels up a little bit more to sort of influence their teams, and ultimately for us to start to build a sustainability champions network across the whole of the organisation. And the sustainability team, of which I'm one member, we have 5 in total, but we're 5,500 colleagues, and we need a champions network in order to be our eyes and ears on the ground, but also to help us create that awareness. What are our issues in Australia versus issues in Singapore versus issues in North America? They're different, they're nuanced. And so we needed that awareness to be able to bring it forward to say, actually, we hear what clients want to do, but this is what we think we can do to help you. And now coming down the horizon on that one is off the back of, it's nearly a year now, Zeros One, is we're now developing a structured and bespoke training program for all of our people, which goes from climate awareness to climate competency, so that people can know how to engage, both with their colleagues, with suppliers, and with clients. And so we're looking at a program which is to equip, engage, and then act. And that is effectively our Zeros One education program. And that is just about to kick off at the start of 2025. Remember which year I'm in. Yeah. It's about awareness and training. And how can I, as an individual, make a difference? Because ultimately, if you try and think about everything about climate change, it can be quite overwhelming. And so you need to bring it down to something that's relatable. At the end of that climate awareness training program on June the 5th, was a litter pickup day, and we had more engagement with people going out to the local sites as groups with the marigolds, with the bags, picking up litter than necessarily we did with the blogs and the videos. And I think that just demonstrates that where you're actually able to see the impact you have, you're more likely to participate. And so it's just trying to get people to sit in front of a blog or trying to get people who are very time poor even to watch a 5-minute video can be quite challenging. So just trying to work out, Mel, how we can engage our people better.
Yeah, it's multifaceted communications plan, really, across not just training, but the blogs, the communications, the interactive sessions, and not just on one day, on Earth Day. It was literally over a couple of months. So the overall impact of that is not just about raising awareness. Interesting, I picked up on that you mentioned, was it equip, engage, and act? So it's almost like the training part is almost like the equip part. Well, here are the tools, and these are the options, and these are the potential initiatives, things that you can do, in your own time at home, what we're doing as an organisation. The engagement, it sounds as though the interactive sessions, that would have been probably a talk trigger for them. But, oh, by the way, I was doing this today, or mentioning it to other colleagues, and, getting them talking about it, which is a key thing, isn't it, really? I think when it comes to any type of change management, to get people talking about what matters.
Oh, very much so.
And then obviously the acting is obviously the next stage as well, which is when you actually start to see some results, and you actually see the impact of what that education or what the equip engage process has actually resulted in.
I think it's just creating a level of awareness and confidence to start the conversation, because we have obviously client relationships, we also have buying relationships, and they are dispersed across the organisation as a whole. And it's just, last week I went on a litter pick. What are you doing? What's your organisation doing? Because I found this really exciting. We've seen it on the international stage as well. We had similar events during that same 6-week period operating in both our Dusseldorf and Munich offices as well. So it's not just a UK-centric operation, but I appreciate each region has its nuances in terms of how we need to operate.
Yeah, but again, I think that's an opportunity, to bring everybody together on a matter that really counts globally and for your organisation. And I'm sure that clients would have been very interested in seeing, images and pictures on, what different representatives of Clyde Co across the globe are getting involved with as well to do their bit. Because I guess it's just taking it beyond, having an impressive looking responsible business report to, yeah, well, these are the results and this is what we're actively working on at the moment. And that's fantastic. Again, one of those initiatives actually that I was interested in was Clyde & Co's community forest up in Northumberland. Could you tell me how that came about, please, Paddy?
Yeah, this was an interesting one. The objectives behind the establishment of the forest were twofold, really. The forest itself was established in early part of 2023, as you said, Crag Estate in Northumberland, which is in the northeast of England, approximately 1 hour from Newcastle. The whole site is about 6.2 hectares of woodland, which we share with 2 other community groups. And it's not just a afforestation project, it's also a biodiversity project in relation particularly the red squirrel ecosystem. Objectives for setting up the forest, first it was to gauge the appetite and engagement of colleagues towards our approach to sustainability, and this came in the form of us offering increased levels of afforestation for every response that we received from colleagues in relation to our annual Have Your Say survey. We went along the lines of, for every response we receive, we'll afforest 2 square metres of land. 5,000 people would give us a hectare. So that was sort of the thinking around it. And as it was, I can't say for definite that the forest increased the response rate, but the response rate increased. And we were able to afforest just under a hectare in the first year. And we've just completed in 2024, actually closing off the project now, we broadly have afforested about 2.6 hectares of the 6.2 is the Clyde Co forest. And the second was a practical exercise for us to just gather some knowledge and experience of what a carbon offset project would look like. So the twos, the benefits, the pros and cons, because ultimately in 2038, we're never going to decarbonize our operations 100%. We know we've got a residual emissions challenge. Hopefully it'll be 10%, it could be less, but hopefully doing no more than 10%. And we will be required to use removal offsets in order to claim net zero against our residual emissions. So it was twofold. It was a engagement test, sense check, but also a test of what we might need to do in the future.
But yeah, I think obviously offsetting options have been around for some time now, and we've covered it previously in the podcast, but it's really interesting to see some of the regenerative agriculture projects that are taking place here in the UK that are making a massive difference as well for organisations and also for farmers, and how we can, repurpose our land to be able to introduce more biodiversity and that sort of thing. And so I guess it's obviously by taking the initiative of having your own community forest, albeit obviously sharing that with others as well, it helps you to actually see it. It goes back to what you said earlier on about getting employees involved and actually seeing the difference that they're making. I think you can relate if it's a specific piece of land in the UK, the operators, the results of your efforts as well and the collaborative relationship that you've got with them compared to some offsetting program in a remote country when you don't actually know exactly what contribution it's making. So yeah, that's really interesting and be interested to see how that progresses as well. So obviously one of the reasons for speaking with you today, Paddy, was to talk about your experience with ISO 14064, which is the carbon footprint verification standard that Clyde & Co have adopted and have had independent verification against. The question for you is around the demand for verification. Obviously, we're seeing an influx of regulatory requirements around sustainability reporting and also independent verification for greenhouse gas emissions. Could you just explain about your view on this, about this greater demand that we're starting to see that's affecting your sector?
Yeah, very much so. The legal services sector, I think, as a whole, and we see this through both the LSA and other industry bodies in which we're involved in, sort of NZLA, Legal Charter 1.5. I think the firms that operate and are members of those bodies are increasingly recognising that not only do lawyers have a key part to play in supporting and advising clients in relation to how they navigate towards a low carbon economy, but I think firms are increasingly recognizing that we are part of their supply chain. We are their scope 3 emissions. So understanding our emissions impact, understanding the level of them and what actions we can take to reduce them, actually proactively assists our clients understand and minimize their own impact. And put bluntly, if you can do this before your peers, it's a market differentiator. So that's where I'm seeing the increase in the demand for the greenhouse gas emissions in the sector is we are being driven there because we are, and I say this a number of times, everybody is somebody's scope 3. So you need to understand.
Mm. And where are you seeing these demands coming from?
Simply our clients. I'd like to say it was a moral imperative, but it's not. Law is not known for being a philanthropic, not-for-profit organisation, and it's simply client-driven. And a report issued this week by Climate Impact Partners interestingly found that the greatest acceleration in significant climate targets is amongst North American companies, despite the significant ESG political movement in the US. Now, according to the report, 79% of North American companies now have climate targets, which is up 6% on last year. Asian companies a little bit behind at about the 45-46%, but UK and European companies still up at the level of 95% have significant climate targets. Those clients at some point, if they haven't already, will be asking their suppliers, their lawyers, to say, where are you on your journey? What is your impact? And how verifiable is your impact? And unless you're able to authentically demonstrate you're on the same journey as your clients, they won't be your clients for very long.
Yeah, I mean, talking about North America, the predominant standard used by the S&P 500 companies in relation to greenhouse gas emissions is ISO 14064, interestingly. And I only know that because I'm doing a master's by research in carbon standards verification to address the climate emergency. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting fact that I think it was 61% of them report under 14064. And that's obviously because there's a greater demand for transparency about greenhouse gas emissions reporting, and the pressures are coming from investors, boards, and consumers to share reliable information. And then obviously to get independent assurance as well, because we're seeing that obviously coming up in CDP, if you want to get higher rating in EcoVadis, for example. And then obviously we've got all the sustainability disclosure requirements that are coming in as well from a regulatory perspective. So could you just share with me a bit about the drivers behind Clyde Co going for verification to 14064? Because in the legal sector, it seems that you are ahead of the game when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions reporting and disclosures.
Yeah, Matt. In part, for all the reasons you've talked about there, given that we've got a high transparency approach to our strategy, we wanted to make sure that the information we were disclosing through CDP, through EcoVadis, etc., was reliable from our perspective, and that we were comfortable that we were putting something out there that there'd been another set of eyes on it. But to be fair, the main driver for us was in particular linked to our sustainability linked credit facilities. We have all of our financing now as an organisation is sustainability linked, and 2 of the 3 KPIs are linked to greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And so from the point of view of that verifiable, that independence piece is not so much for us, it's actually for our banks to understand that there's been another set of eyes looked at this and said, yeah, it's right. And if we meet our KPIs, our interest charges go down, so we benefit. If we fail them, our interest charges go up. So it's in both of our interests to make sure that the emissions footprint is independently and objectively verified, and it's part of the reason instead of going for limited assurance, we absolutely wanted reasonable assurance under 14,064, which I think, and forgive me on this one, I think that's at least 70% plus in terms of the verification level. So it's about as robust as it can get, because it actually makes a financial impact to us.
That's really interesting, Paddy. Yeah. Well, actually, it's been cropping up a few times about the difference between limited and reasonable assurance. And we're actually going to be getting David Algar, the principal carbonologist at Carbonology to come onto the podcast to share some insights into that, because obviously I know that you worked with David on this as a verification body. When it comes to quantification, so obviously before you get to the verification, there's a lot of number crunching involved and a lot of data gathering. And I think in some cases, I understand that it can be a little bit like getting blood out of a stone. What would you say have been the main challenges for Clyde Co when it comes to quantifying and gathering that information?
You've summed it up there, Mel, getting blood out of a stone. For an organisation of our size, the challenge has been that the data is going to come from a myriad of sources. Even when we look at the scope 1 in terms of energy we directly consume, we've got, let's say, nearly 65 to 70 sites across the globe. And just getting that data from a small team of 5 is a challenge. It's time consuming. And similarly, the quality of the data, because as you will appreciate, actually us getting genuine greenhouse gas emissions data from somebody else is a challenge because they're not necessarily engaged. So it's getting the quality of data that allows us either to have kilowatt hours or spend that you're going to be able to then convert into greenhouse gas emissions that you're then going to be able to convert into some sort of verifiable information. So it is just that, it's that chase exercise. That is the biggest challenge, as well as then once you've got a point of contact, how do you improve the quality of the data you get thereafter? So ultimately, at the end of the day, you want somebody to give you a greenhouse gas emissions piece of information. But up until that point, there's always some form of protocol you're going to have to follow, be it estimation, process, actual. I think it's sort of the improvement of the quality as we look up the pyramid. But yeah, it's the blood out of a stone is a good way of putting it now.
Yeah, so obviously, now that you've done that and you've had those greenhouse gas emissions, the methodology, the report, the statement are all independently verified. What impact would you say that this has had on your sustainability credentials now?
Very simply, I think it just validates. It certainly supports what we're trying to achieve. I think without that sort of independent third-party view, it demonstrates we're doing things rather than just saying things. So it's only supportive of what we're trying to achieve. And it's helpful for Blackmores and Carbonology to be able to say, this is us independently. Clyde's may have done the calculation, but we've had a look at it and it looks okay and it sits with an ISO standard. So it's very much enhancing the credentials, at the very least, maintaining them.
Great. And what would you say has been the main benefit then now from verification? I know that obviously it's a fairly recent thing for Clyde and Co. And it may be a bit early days to say, but I mean, based on your experience, what would you say have been the main benefits?
Certainly in supporting our sustainability certification with the banks, that's a tick. It's helped us do that. It's actually made our audit this year simpler in the sense of, whilst we didn't necessarily have the greenhouse gas emissions footprint in our TCFD and SECAR reporting last year, we were working our way through it. And so our financial auditors were spending a lot of time talking about the to and fro and how we got there. Actually, this year, with an independent certification, it's almost a case of their stress test is who's the organisation and what's the level of accreditation. Fine, tick, we'll rely on their evidence. And so it's made that piece a lot simpler. And obviously that's the way we're going to go forward. And I know we did work this year. We did 2 years worth of work this year. But I think it adds a level of credibility that perhaps an internal calculation doesn't.
Great. And no, thanks for sharing that. And I think, last question from me then about this experiences. What top tip would you give to an organisation looking to verify their data?
This one's an easy one. Do not let perfection get in the way of progress. The data gathering, the improving the quality can have you deep in the weeds at times, and it will be a journey. And this is one of the things I talk to my team about. Sometimes the phrase audit gives the impression you need to be defensible because what you're trying to do is avoid errors being picked up. What I would say, because of the journey that you have to take in greenhouse gas emissions, don't fear the verification process. Use it constructively, because the fresh pair of eyes coming at it can potentially guide you to focus areas that perhaps you've not seen. Just because the level of data you're trying to manipulate and manage, you might just miss. So I say, don't fear it, lean into it, and use the outcome as a means of improving.
Yeah, I think that's some great advice there, Paddy. So thank you very much for sharing that. I think especially as, like you said, this is a journey and, we're not going to know how well we're actually doing along that journey towards net zero if, first of all, we have to start, monitoring, measuring, validating, verifying our progress. But again, it's something that an organization would do year after year after year. So in theory, it should get easier, it should get better, and yeah, in effect, it should then become business as usual, hopefully, as an organisation progresses. Well, lovely. It's been wonderful to have you on the podcast today, Paddy. A couple of questions that I usually ask our guests as well is if you could gift a book to somebody, what would it be and why?
This would be the fiction novel The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, which was published in 2020, and I think it was one of Barack Obama's must-read books. For those of your listeners who've not heard of it, it's a novel set in, describe the near future, and it follows a subsidiary body established under the Paris Agreement, whose mission is to act as advocate for the world's future generations of citizens, as if their rights was as valid as the present generation. So it's an interesting novel.
Oh, interesting. Mm.
What I would say is the climatic events that are described in the book are not exaggerated. They are real and they're being experienced now, and you can see them all around you now. And what I would say is I appreciate I'm in the sustainability bubble, but for anybody who's in doubt or still on the fence about the impact of climate change, they need to read this just to get the holistic view of what the combined impact on the world could be. And actually, that sounds rather down, but actually what the combined effect on the world if we all could work together to fix it. So it's a fantastic book. It starts quite scarily, and I won't spoil it. It does get better though.
I'm going to be sticking it on my Audible wish list this weekend. Yeah, definitely. And then finally, what's your favourite quote that you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
This one is something I've known for a while. I had the pleasure of meeting the individual at dinner in June of this year, actually meeting the individual and sitting next to him for a course, which was fascinating. And it's from Robert Swan, OBE, who is the first person in history to walk both the North and the South Poles. He's a UN Goodwill Ambassador for Youth, and he's also, I can't remember the exact name of the organisation, but he's looking to protect Antarctica through to 1941. And his quote is rather simple, but it's the greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it.
Yeah. Good way to end the podcast today. Once again, really appreciate your time today, Paddy. You've been a fantastic guest, and we'll be including details from today's podcast in the show notes as well. So we'll be making a link to the Clyde Co website for anybody that's interested in reading that responsible business report that we've been highlighting sections of today. So yes, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Real pleasure. Interesting conversation. And I'm glad you stuck on script, because there are times when I've gone through some of these that we've ended up going completely off on a tangent.
So yeah, I'm sure you'll all agree that Paddy's been an amazing guest today on the podcast. Just a reminder that any other information that you need in relation to verification of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in relation to ISO 14064, but any other standards such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as well, and topics that we've discussed today are all going to be available in the links in the show notes. So thanks very much for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the ISO Show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.